Welcome back, everyone. This is Treks to Nowhere. Well, after spending a wonderful week with our favorite coronavirus friend, I am back. And in the previous episode, part one of a three-part miniseries, we began the full story surrounding my 2012 Barkley Marathons run. I chose to flip things around a bit and begin the story at the end. And so in that episode, we went back to the moments, days, and weeks immediately following my finish. We revisited just what it was like to mentally and physically recover from such a demanding event, and the relative PTSD I suffered from as a result. Finishing the Barkley Marathons had monumentally profound impacts on me, many of which I still carry with me to this day. It is simply impossible for an event like the Barkley to not have a life-altering impact on those that choose to fully commit. There is no other way of saying it. The Barkley Marathons changes a person irrevocably. Now, in this episode, we'll go in the other direction and go back to the very beginning, to the days before I even knew that the Barkley Marathons existed. I will tell you the story of how I came to learn of this unusual race and how it ultimately lured me in, tempted me, and latched itself onto me with its insidious claws. I will tell you how the Barkley Marathons ultimately became my entire world for more than 8 months, and how I necessarily became obsessed with it. I will also revisit some of my training from that year and explain the physical and mental toll it all took on me in the weeks leading up to the race. And so, with that introduction out of the way, let's dive into the Barkley Marathons prologue. There have been moments that have punctuated my life when I've seen a very specific image and something remarkable happens. I may be casually flipping through a magazine or a website, and then the world simply stops. Suddenly, there is an image in front of me that draws me in entirely. Everything else around me becomes distant and vacant, and I am pulled into that image. Every small detail in that one picture becomes enormous, and a small switch is flipped in my mind and in my soul. That switch activates one all-consuming and ceaseless desire within me. No matter how long it may take, and no matter what it may take, I am singularly driven to find a way to put myself into that image. This happened to me the first time I saw a picture of the Appalachian Trail terminus sign on Mount Katahdin. From that moment when I first glimpsed that faded sawhorse-style wooden sign, I knew with an absolute certainty that I would one day be standing next to it myself and resting my hands upon it. Late in the fall of 2011, I stumbled across a single image of Brett Mowney standing at the yellow gate marking the start and finish line of the Barkley Marathons. In that image, Brett was actively moving his hand down to touch the gate at the end of his fifth and final loop, and was just a few mere centimeters away from making contact with the dull and sun-faded yellow paint of the gate. Having only just recently learned what the Barkley Marathons was, I realized that this photo represented the final second of time in Brett's nearly 58-hour run. So, in that precise moment that this photo was taken, Brett was still effectively on course. Yet, less than a second later, the time it probably took for the image to be stored into the digital camera's memory, he would become the 10th person to ever finish the event. This singular thought absolutely captivated me. I thought about what sheer joy and relief Brett must have been feeling in those precise moments, knowing that the agony and despair that he had accumulated over 57 hours was about to end. I stared at that photo for what seemed like hours, playing out countless scenarios and conversations in my head. Just what sort of stories would Brett have from his 57 hours out there? Did Brett ever get lost during his run and worry he might not finish? Was there ever a point on the course where Brett considered actually quitting? what does it actually feel like to finish something so seemingly impossible? When my mind finally came back to the present moment and my imagination settled, I was overcome with one singular notion. I too wanted to rest my hands upon that gate after a fifth loop at the Barkley Marathons. I wanted to experience what Brett was experiencing in that photo, and I wanted to know the enormity of all that I could imagine in that brief moment of timelessness that was forever captured in that single image. I had heard about the Barkley Marathons a few times in the past, but had never really fully investigated it too deeply. Sometime around 2008, right after I had started dabbling in long distance running, a grad school friend of mine sent me a New York Times article about the race. In this article, there was a photo of people scrambling up a briar infested hillside on all fours, and I remember thinking to myself, well, that doesn't really look like it would be much fun. Still, there was a part of me that was intrigued. Clearly, there was a reason people would subject themselves to such discomfort, no? After skimming the article and learning of the race's enormity and historically low finisher rate, there was one name that caught my attention with respect to a recent finisher. That name was Brian Robinson. I couldn't quite remember where I had heard that name before, but I knew it was familiar. However, before I could dig into that question any further, my thoughts were interrupted by my office mate, reminding me of the large math modeling project we had due the following day. I knew I had hours of MATLAB coding ahead of me, so I quickly filed the Barkley article away for another day. Years went by, and thoughts of the Barkley Marathons had faded into the deep recesses of my mind. In 2010, after 2 years of successful long-distance running, I decided to take a break in favor of my true passion of motion, long-distance hiking. I had just completed my master's degree program, and before diving headfirst into a grueling PhD program, I wanted to take the summer to simply explore. As such, I dedicated all of my mental and physical energy towards the preparation of a summertime thru hike along the Pacific Crest Trail. It was while on this Western States walkabout that my first Barkley Marathons memory resurfaced. This single memory would eventually light the small spark that would burgeon into the uncontrollable Barkley wildfire that would so completely consume me. Somewhere in Northern California, after successfully navigating my way through several hundred miles of the snowy Sierra Mountains, I found myself in a hostel bunkhouse in the town of Old Station. Along one of the walls of this hostel, in a corner, near a refrigerator completely covered in beer stickers, was a framed and faded photo of a thru hiker. Near the bottom of this picture was a small printed block of text appearing as an epigraph or dedication of some kind. Upon closer inspection of the photo, the text came into focus. It read, "Flyin' Brian Robinson, the first person to complete the calendar year Triple Crown of thru hiking." Brian Robinson. And then I remembered, Brian was the same person I had read about 2 years prior in my office, related to that bizarre and somewhat sadistic race in the mountains of Tennessee. What was its name again? Barstow, Burbank, Berkeley? Clearly my head was in California. That night, I made a note to myself in my hiking journal to make sure to look up this race as soon as I had access to the internet again. This epiphany of sorts would be the first time that fate had attempted to nudge me in the direction of the Barkley. But by the time I made it to the next town library with a public terminal, I had again forgotten about Brian or my reminder note, and therefore failed to discover that he was in fact a finisher of the infamous Barkley Marathons. A full year later, in 2011, I shifted back to long-distance running and was planning for another big summer of mountain ultramarathons. As I was narrowing down which races I might attempt, I chose to filter my search results based on those races that might also serve as qualifiers for the Hard Rock 100 run, a race that I had wanted to participate in since learning of it all the way back in 2008 while on my Colorado Trail thru hike. As I perused the list of candidate races and ultimately decided on the Leadville 100 as my target event, I recalled that one listed qualifying race was unfamiliar to me: the Barkley Marathons. Why did that name sound so familiar? After a quick web search, I realized that this was the same event I had read about 3 years prior in the New York Times article. I spent the subsequent hour tunneling down my first Barkley rabbit hole and could feel myself getting drawn in as though it were some kind of inescapable neutron star with the gravity of a million suns. I also rediscovered the name Brian Robinson and recalled his framed photo at the old station hostel. This was now the second time that fate had been steering me to a place that I hadn't yet realized was unavoidable. That August, I found myself in Leadville, Colorado, trained and ready to tackle the 100-mile mountain foot race. I had secured a bunk at the Leadville hostel, and a few days before the race, I was sharing a community meal at the table with several other guests. I found myself engaging in an interesting conversation with one other guest, Matt, about the Hard Rock 100. He told me that a few years prior, he had actually missed the 48-hour cutoff by mere seconds, and the story he unraveled was absolutely captivating. We ultimately traded many of our respective tales over that dinner. We exchanged our stories of ultramarathons, of which he had completed countless more than me, stories of our respective Colorado 14er summits, and stories of my Antarctic deployments. At one point, he casually said to me, "Hey, it sounds like you really enjoy a good challenge. You should submit an application to the Barkley Marathons." There was that damn name again. Long dormant synapses excitedly began to fire, and a connection was made. I suddenly recognized with whom I was speaking. In my previous searching of the Barkley Marathons, I had come across one website that detailed the race more than any other, a site that also included countless race reports of previous participants. That site was also created and maintained by a former participant, a participant named Matt Mahoney. This was now the third time that the universe at large was seemingly working to tell me something, and fate had finally locked in on its target. And then there was the epiphany. "Matt, if you're willing to share, please tell me everything about the Barkley. I want to know it all." He could immediately sense that I was unquestionably hooked, and it was in that precise moment that there would be no turning back. The barbs of the Barkley Marathons had become securely latched into me, and I was now its prisoner. We spoke for hours that night, and I learned of the lore and history of this peculiar event. I sat like a quiet and attentive sponge, soaking up whatever nuggets of wisdom Matt was willing to share. I sensed quickly that our conversation was somewhat sacred, and that such privileged information is not typically shared. But he could sense my giddiness and the fierceness in my eyes. He could sense that I wanted it all. I wanted to experience the entirety of the Barkley. He went on to tell me that whenever he brings up the Barkley Marathons in conversation, there are always one or two people that have what he called the fire. He went on to explain that he wasn't entirely sure what the fire was, only that he recognized it when it was there. Matt also explained that whatever this fire was, he was convinced that it was essential for success at the race. Like an eager apprentice, I took painstaking notes, and at the end of our long conversation, he finally shared with me the ultimate secret: the instructions I would need to submit an application for the 2012 event. I had learned that this was highly coveted and tightly guarded knowledge that was rarely shared. I agreed to keep that knowledge as tight as I could and share it with no one. 2 days later, I was traversing along the immaculate single track of the Colorado Trail during the Leadville 100-foot race. And despite the pristine trails and incredible landscapes, for the nearly 25 hours of my run, all that occupied my mind were images of the briar-infested mountains of Tennessee. The Barkley Marathons had successfully consumed my mind and soul. This would become a theme in my entire reality for the next 8 months. What I would come to discover much later is that this level of singular focus and unhealthy obsession, somewhat akin to a blind religious fervor, is what must be sustained if one is to be successful at the Barkley. One important detail that I had learned from Matt Mahoney's archive website in all of my research was that the Barkley Marathons boasted a 1% finisher rate over its 25-year history. 10 finishers out of roughly 1,000 total runners. So, should I be accepted to run, how was I, an admitted middle-of-the-pack runner, going to complete such a nigh impossible race? Over the subsequent 6 months, I dedicated all of my free time and energy to studying what I could of this race. I read every race report that I could get my hands on, studied every page of Ed Furtaugh's famous Barkley book that details the history of the event, and scrutinized every map of Frozen Head that I could find. I made it a goal to know every single topographical contour of the park with my eyes closed. I would memorize every drainage, every gully, every small rise or knoll, every ridgeline, and every specific elevation. I drew detailed mental pictures in my mind of every location in the park, based solely on a combination of the available maps and race reports. My impossible goal was this: regardless of my whereabouts in the park, I wanted to be able to know my precise location based on my surroundings alone. I treated this all as something of a doctoral candidacy exam, breaking down this monumental task into equivalent first principles. I would study every fundamental of the race, the park, the terrain, and the numerous reports. I made flashcards to study, frequently quizzed myself, and developed hypothetical scenarios to play out. I learned how to subtly interpret and translate specific descriptions in past runners' reports and was slowly able to tease out precise locations given those descriptions. In time, with all of the information I had accrued and learned, I was even able to sketch out what I believed to be a fairly accurate estimate of the course itself, at least as it was the previous few years. This was crucial, as the specific course does change from year to year and is never publicly shared. Of course, none of this preparation would matter if I wasn't actually invited to participate, or if I couldn't also get myself into the best physical shape of my life. I knew that just getting invited was going to be a challenge as well. I did have a decent number of ultramarathon finishes on my resume, but I hoped that my thru hikes and my time in Antarctica would give me a more unique application. I spent several days writing my entrance essay about why I thought I could finish, listing all of my strengths and accomplishments, but in the end, deleted it all and simply said something like, "Laz, nothing I can tell you about myself really matters, as you've likely heard it all before. I really just want to feel what it's like to be at the complete limit of my physical and mental capabilities. I want to feel what it's like to push myself to an absolute extreme point of whimpering in a corner, only to get kicked again while down. So I ask that you give me the opportunity to be tortured and maimed so that I may call myself a Barkley runner." Several months later, with my essay now complete and ready to submit, I found myself stationed thousands of miles from home alongside a skeleton crew of researchers at a remote field camp in West Antarctica. I was living out of a small tent atop the ice sheet and working long 12-hour shifts as part of an ice core processing crew. The working conditions were both harsh and demanding. This camp, known as Wace Divide, was also located on the highest point of an expansive ice sheet. This meant that there was effectively no topography for hundreds of miles. It was flat and white for as far as you could see in all directions. For internet connectivity, the Waist Divide Field Camp relied on a retired military satellite that operated for only about 40 minutes a day when the satellite was in the right place in orbit. Because of this, I had to configure a special email scheduler to auto-send my application essay on the exact entry date and time it was due, since it was during a time when the satellite was not overhead. In truth, I had no way of actually knowing if it was going to work as programmed. I did ultimately learn that my application for the 2012 Barkley Marathons was received, and the following day during our next internet window, I also learned that I was accepted by way of a condolence letter. This is the only race that I can think of where you are invited to run with an apology. We're sorry to tell you that you've been invited to run this horrible race. When I learned of this news, I was overcome with a feeling of excitement, but also a feeling of dread. It had all suddenly become very real. Another disturbing realization also became very clear in that moment. I was now thousands of miles from home, cold, overworked, somewhat out of shape, and nearly alone, and yet I had to find a way to begin an intense physical training plan in a place with no topography to speak of. I immediately sent a short follow-up email to Laz. I told him simply that I was happy to accept my invitation, and then asked him if there was anything else I needed to do before race day. He replied almost immediately with just two simple words: hill training. Of course, this was not the most encouraging advice to receive from the Barkley Marathons race director given my current surroundings, but I still had to smirk. I decided that my best and really only course of action would be to focus on building up whatever fitness base I could, and then simply hope for an on-time or even early end to the field season. Once home, I could then direct all of my efforts towards aggressive hill workouts in the few months leading up to the race. So, for the next 3 weeks following my daily 12-hour ice core processing shifts, I would suit up in my heavy polar gear and go out for nightly 10K runs around the station. The running was difficult and exhausting, as the snow surface was awkward and uneven, much like running on sand. Typical ambient temperatures also hovered around -30°C. I soon learned that the heavy machine operators at the camp had built small 3-meter snow berms behind the cargo line to block wind and prevent snow drifts. I would exploit this artificial topography, completing hundreds of short repeats up and down these berms. By the third week, I was running nearly 60 miles and somehow accumulating several thousand feet of elevation gain by way of 10-foot incremental repeats. Some good news came at the end of this third week when the chief scientist informed us all that we needed to start sending people home in shifts. Normally, I would choose to stay as long as possible at a remote field camp like Waist Divide, but in this case, I very quickly volunteered to leave camp in the first wave. I needed to get back to the steep and technical ridges of the Appalachian Mountains near my home in central Pennsylvania. I left camp and spent 2 days at the primary McMurdo station en route back to the States. While there, I was able to somehow squeeze in over a dozen repeats on the 700-foot volcanic peak in town known as Observation Hill. I could already tell that the 3 months of hard field work coupled with the 3 weeks of difficult running was paying off. When I finally got home in the last week of January, I wasted no time. I took just 1 day to rest before diving in head first. I knew that the next 9 weeks would be absolutely brutal and soul-crushing, but in many ways I was excited and eager to get after it. I would need to subject my mind and body to a training regimen like nothing I had ever endured. I would likely have to run upwards of 100 miles per week, carry out grueling hill repeats, and accumulate tens of thousands of feet of total elevation gain. Any previous through hikes or 100-mile training blocks would pale in comparison to what I would need to do in order to be successful at the Barkley. I began by quickly sketching out my weeks. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays would be for working on base mileage and speed, with some occasional hills, and Tuesdays and Thursdays would be entirely dedicated to hill workouts, with the goal of achieving at least 5,000 feet of gain per workout. Lastly, I would leave the weekends for back-to-back long and hilly adventures. These might include 2 20-mile trail runs with 10,000 feet of elevation gain each, or an overnight FKT attempt on a local 40-mile backcountry trail. Regardless of the specific workouts, my weekends would be entirely swallowed up by training, with maybe a few hours set aside for some sleep. I started my first week with a modest 60 miles of running and just 15,000 feet of total elevation. I had already found 2 excellent candidate sites for my midweek hill repeat sessions during this first week. In addition, within a local state park, there was a well-established 20-mile looped trail that featured just under 5,000 feet of gain. I ran this loop trail on both Saturday and Sunday, and by that Sunday evening, I was already exhausted, but knew that there would be no time to slow things down and no time for resting. The weeks progressed somewhat linearly from there. In the second and third weeks, I ran 75 and 80 miles respectively, again repeating the 20-mile back-to-back weekend loops. By the fourth week, I had reached my first 90-mile week, and in addition to the 40-mile, 10,000-foot weekend workouts, I added in a new long run on that Wednesday, which also added another 2,000 feet of gain. I was beginning to finally feel strength returning to my legs, and my overall fitness improving. During my fifth week of training, I again totaled about 90 miles of cumulative running, but I had added on a new challenge. Rather than my typical back-to-back hilly weekend runs, I instead chose to do a full-on FKT-style blitz on a local 42-mile wilderness trail known as the Black Forest Trail. This trail is notoriously difficult and features almost 10,000 feet of gain. I had actually hiked this trail over a 3-day weekend back in 2006. I remembered it being quite feisty and technical. I had decided that tackling the entire Black Forest Trail loop in one day would really help to build my overall endurance and stamina. In the end, it took me over 11 hours to complete the circuit, but it gave me a realistic sampling of what I might expect on a single loop at the Barkley. In my sixth week of training, I stepped it up yet again, this time with the goal of also working on my navigation and ability to deal with sleep deprivation. To do this, I set out to speed hike 70 miles along a local long-distance trail in Pennsylvania known as the Mid-State Trail. I had never hiked on this trail before, but it did essentially pass right by my hometown. I asked my partner if she would drop me off 70 miles from home near the trail, and then I'd simply hike along the trail back home. I chose to start this challenge late in the day so that I'd also be doing much of the hiking through the night. I purposely wanted to tackle this hike while cold, hungry, tired, and sleep deprived. I also wanted to set myself up in such a way that I was going to get lost and therefore have to hone my compass navigation skills. In some sort of twisted, sadistic way, these were all perfect Barkley training conditions. In the end, the 70-mile hike was a success and took me nearly 22 hours to complete. Along the way, I did get lost several times as I expected, but always managed to find my way back to a preferred location on my map, using only my compass and the various surrounding natural landmarks and features to guide me. The late winter Pennsylvania weather was also cold and miserable during the overnight, and I had to work through a very tired mind and uncomfortable body. Again, ideal Barkley conditions. I learned very well what to do, and more importantly, what not to do when presented with such conditions. My Barkley training block peaked during my 7th and 8th weeks, which both consisted of over 100 miles and 30,000 cumulative feet of gain. At the start of my 9th and final week, I felt stronger and more prepared than I ever had before leading up to a race. I ran a relatively light 40 miles during the final taper week and it felt effortless. On my very last run before packing up and heading down to Frozen Head for the race, I ran a familiar and hilly loop trail in my neighborhood. On the final descent down from the ridgeline, I stopped to rest on a tree stump. I can remember looking out across an early budding spring landscape and breathing in the cool and crisp air. My surroundings were quiet and still. I thought about how I had just made it through the entire training block successfully and, more importantly, uninjured. I was excited and eager to test myself at the Barkley, and I felt like I had trained as much as I physically could while still leaving time to squeeze in my graduate school research, and of course a few hours of sleep each night. There was no doubt that I was utterly exhausted, but I was also incredibly fit. This level of training is absolutely unsustainable, but I was nearly on the other side. I ran the final mile back to my car while blanketed by a complete sense of calm. I had prepared myself as best I could for the challenge I had ahead of me. All that was left for me to do was show up. And that, my friends, concludes part 2 of my Barkley Marathon story. You've now heard both the prologue and the epilogue of my Barkley experience. All that remains is the story of the race itself. Therefore, in the next and final episode, we'll conclude this Barkley trilogy with the full account of my race and my time at Frozen Head during the 2012 Barkley Marathons. Take care, everyone, and be safe out there.